everyone, welcome to the first in our Odinism videos. Today we're going to be examining the religion of Odinism at a critical historical level in comparing the sacred text of Odinism, what are known as the Eddas, and the Bible as a whole. Now, you may be wondering first and foremost, why compare the two? Well, any system of belief is going to involve two key things, a book and a man, a standard to follow and an example set. And if we're going to give our fellow human beings the respect that they deserve, we should always be willing to hear out what they believe and why. And along with the starting point, we also need to know why people believe anything. And for most, it's to answer some of life's most important questions. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Is there a God? If so, does he care about us? What does he expect of us? And most importantly, how do we know that the answers to these questions are true? This not only brings us back to the book and the man for answers, but hopefully answers that give us enough reasons to end up with reasonable conclusions. I wouldn't believe in something if I had good reasons to believe that it was false, and if people claim that Odinism is true, well, their reasons are worth looking into. Now, why go to their book instead of asking Odinists? While some Odinists are given more attention than others, we can't look to modern individuals to define a system of belief for us because they didn't come up with it. The only one who would know whether or not something was true in the realm of belief is the one who came up with those core claims in the first place. I would no more call Odinism a terrorist religion because of Anders Breivik than I would consider Christianity an ignorant and hostile religion because some Christians are ignorant and hostile. And in the same way, the question of Christianity's truth stands or falls on the man, Jesus of Nazareth, and whether or not he knew what he was talking about, and the book that collects those sayings and his witness in history, known as the Bible. Likewise, the truth of Odinism stands or falls on whether or not Snorri Sturluson accurately gathered the oral tradition handed down to us from Odin himself. This is the fine line between speculation, man's views about God, and revelation, God's revelation of himself to us. If the Eddas of Odinism is in fact a reliable and testable source of historical fact, then Odinism's true whether we like it or not. And in the spirit of all consistency, if the Bible passes this test, we should also come to the same conclusion. Now, what kind of standards will be applied then? Well, while the Bible puts forward its own tests and standards to recognize whether the God of Israel was speaking or not, the Eddas doesn't. And so to level the playing field, we're going to treat each as basic historical documents and test whether or not we can verify their claims the same way we would anything else in history. History, or the word histor in Greek, means eyewitness. And if something was seen by someone and we have reason to trust what they said, then it's history by definition. This is done in a variety of ways. For example, the first test of history, and probably the most strict, is the standard of multiple attestation. What other sources can we look to around the same time that say the basic same thing? Second are accounts of embarrassment. What details are we given that wouldn't have been made up or embellished? And finally, contemporary work. How close to the original eyewitnesses can we find evidence to support their claims? Well, if these standards seem unreasonable, or if a more solid method of testing exists, then I'll happily apply them here as well. But what we're going to do is apply these tests and compare the Bible to the Eddas based off of the sheer number of verifiable historical claims, and then come to our conclusions. Now, will these standards be applied fairly? I have made it no secret that I myself am a Christian, but I also have made it known that I have relatives that are Odinists, that I have strong Swedish and Norse blood, and that this is a belief system and a culture very close to my heart. So understand that historical tests obviously wouldn't apply to either claims that we can't confirm or that weren't historical claims to begin with. For example, when the Bible mentions in the Psalms that God will cover us with the shadow of his wings, it doesn't mean that he's a chicken. And nor does the Havolmo present itself as anything more than wise sayings, much like the Old Testament's book of Proverbs. The sayings themselves could be true, and it would only show that the author knew how life worked. It wouldn't necessarily confirm or dismiss any claims to divine origins. Now note, for the book of Proverbs, we can test whether or not Solomon existed, or go to more direct conversations that Odin himself had in Vafthrûsnismál that were meant to be understood as him testing the wise giant as to whether or not he knew how the world worked. Cultural perspectives and terms will also be taken into consideration, but when the plain truth is stated in full context as a historical claim, we will test it as such, both for the Bible and for the Eddas. So beginning with the Eddas, the law of multiple attestation. Does the Eddas fall into this standard of testing? Unfortunately, no. The claims that it makes about history remain entirely on its own authority. Now note, that does not automatically mean it's false, but that does mean that we can't test the Eddas based on this standard. We're going to have to look to other areas in order to say whether or not the scholars that test this work deem it as mythology or not, since the claims that it makes about the Azir and the origins of the universe can't be tested. We have to look elsewhere. Now note, they may be true, but we can't test them through multiple attestation. We're going to need to look elsewhere. The second standard, accounts of embarrassment, which fortunately for Odinism's case includes some very embarrassing details about the gods of Odinism through the Eddas. And if analyzed historically, this method of criticism would conclude that there were in fact details to be admitted rather than to be embellished. First, in the Lay of Thrym, or Thrymsvika, I believe would be the proper pronunciation, in verses 10 through 20, Loki reports to Thor that his hammer, Mjolnir, is stolen, and the only way to get it back is to have the goddess Freya marry the giants. Freya, obviously not wanting to capitulate for Thor's negligence, among other things. She doesn't want to marry the giants. Thor is forced to, so basically to pull a Bugs Bunny. He's forced to cross-dress in a bridal gown with Loki. He didn't seem too hesitant about it, to retrieve the hammer dressed as a woman. And according to verse 16, he was not happy about the arrangement, lest he be called, as some translations refer to it, as effeminate or unmanly. However, the literal translation was the suggestion that he would be a homosexual. So, noting that. In the second example of embarrassment in the Eddas, in the wranglings of Loki, also known as Lokasenna, in verse 20, 26, 30, 32, 52, and 54, Freya, Frigg, Sif, Skadi, Ithun, and Loki himself expose serial infidelity as well as fratricide, Loki taking credit for Baldur's death, and as well Freya and Frigg noting their infidelity to Odin and their husbands. This, of course, was not to be outdone by Loki's own history of, at one time, becoming a female, birthing a child, and all doing this, by the way, to prevent a giant from completing a task that was required of him by the Azir, who promised Freya, once again, as a reward. And this is according to the commentaries of Dr. Henry Adams Bellows, one of the most prominent English translators of the Eddas in the modern era. Finally, the poem of Harbath, or Harbasloth, in verses 30 through 34 mentions Thor and Odin having a conversation about Odin's sexual adventures. And in verse 32, Odin mentions that he needed Thor's help in holding the white maid fast. And I quote, to which Thor replied in the positive, had he been there. While certain points of culture, like rape in the poem of Harbath, were overlooked, infidelity and cross-dressing, on the part of the woman at least, and for the man, were humiliating in Norse culture, and would have been spoken of the greatest, wouldn't have rather been spoken of the greatest of the Azir, unless they had to admit these details. And in the realm of historical criticism, these events would increase the likelihood of these events being true, since they harm the reputation of individuals that you'd expect embellishment from. Moving on to contemporary work, we're going to go into a little bit of history. Now, if you get tired or dreary, feel free to skip this because it gives us very limited information. But for those who take this religion seriously, understand that much like our own beliefs, speaking to my fellow Christians, we need to be able to know how historical data is tested, not just for other books, but for our own. So note this. According to the Eddas itself, and the scholarly notes of translators, the earliest evidence of the Eddas in writing is what's called the Codex Regius, or R2365. It was discovered by a Christian bishop named Brynjolfur Svensson. This was in 1643, where at the time testing manuscripts wasn't actually a complete science yet. But with what methods he could employ, he dated the writing back to the 1300s in the modern era. This was attributed later to a man named Snorri Sturluson by Angrimur Johnson. And these quotations that were recognized as Norse poems do fit within the time frame this man would have lived, passing through Iceland, where the manuscript was likely made. On top of this, there are other claims that these works go back even farther in writing to the works of Saemund the Wise in the 11th century. This would be around 1000. Whether or not this is true remains an open question, since all the written material from him has been lost. Going with what we have then, the earliest written example of Odinism's core claims date to 1,000 years after Gothic and German cultures began interacting with Christians and converting to Christianity. The only earlier mention of anything close to Odinism are recorded in Fox's Book of Martyrs, where a missionary encountered a shrine to the Norse god Thor. His tree was sacred, and the local shamans threatened the missionary that he would be struck with lightning if he even touched the tree. Taking up an axe, he cut down the tree and showed Thor, as they understood him then, was a false god, and the tribe converted to Christianity. Details have likely been embellished, noting that it only took one swing before a mighty wind toppled the tree as a sign from God to the Nords, but nonetheless, the adherents to the cult of Arianism, not Christian sources by the way, do confirm that this was the basic time frame when the Goths and Visigoths started to become Christian. This is the earliest documented mention of Thor in history. So, noting that then, we have this reason at least to trust the premise that the Eddas is based on oral tradition that went before its time. This is all we can conclude. So, in conclusion, the scholars would say that the Eddas is mythological because the vast majority of its historical claims can't be tested or verified by any standard apart from itself. However, due to the culturally embarrassing details given about the Azir's poor moral character and having to admit to things that their own culture frowned upon, a genuine Odinist could use these embarrassing details to prove that it wasn't fictional, because the examples of their moral paragons fall short of their own standards. Without these things, however, Odinism doesn't have anything else to stand on, since the remains of giants, the werebears, fallen Valkyrie, etc., haven't been discovered or verified as things. So moving on to the Bible. Does it pass these same standards? Well, in the realm of multiple attestation, understand first and foremost that the Old and New Testaments are set in three categories: history, poetry, and prophecy. And since historical tests usually fit with historical claims, we're going to test what we can with what we know for certain. And just like with the Eddas, we're going to conclude what we can know for certain as reasons to trust this. So, if the Eddas gave us reasons to trust its claims by getting historical claims right, then the claims we couldn't test historically, for example, would be that much more likely to be true. This is faith. It's trust with reason, and you won't trust something unless you're given reason to. At least that's when it's most justified. So, where are the reasons to trust the Bible historically? First and foremost, regarding multiple attestation, we have the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah confirmed by the Ebla tablets, which mention their cities' names as trade partners in the ancient city of Ebla, and this dates to earlier than when we thought, up until the time of the discovery of these clay tablets, writing even existed, and yet we not only have writing, We have receipts. Likewise, the exodus of Israel to and from Egypt is supported by the discovery of Joseph and his brothers' estates in the ruins known as Avaris. This is a region beneath the city of Ramesses today. Third, the intervention of God in Isaiah 37 and the Taylor Prism both verify the loss of Sennacherib, the Assyrian king's army, at Jerusalem. You can see this in the British Museum today. The destruction of Jerusalem reported in Jeremiah and Lamentations all are supported by the Babylonian records of Nebuchadnezzar's conquests. No details are spared on either account. Going into the New Testament, Tacitus, who is a Roman historian, wrote in his book Annals, book 18, and, I skipped my place there. In the Annals, book 15 and chapter 44, that Jesus was executed as a criminal during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. The Talmud, which was the writing of the Pharisees, by no means supporters of Christianity, wrote in Talmud Sanhedrin 67 that Jesus was executed by the Romans. And Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, not himself a Christian, reported Jesus was executed during the governorship of Pontius Pilate in Antiquities, Book 18, Section 3 and verse 3. And note he also verifies the claims that he made to be Messiah. So in conclusion, given the fact that these and other claims fall in line with verifiable historical data, people, places, and things that say the same basic thing the Bible says about what happened in history, we have that many more reasons to trust the information we have from a purely historical stance. Now, does this automatically mean that the God of Israel is real? No, we need more data for that. But does it mean that the people who wrote the Bible were writing about things that actually happened? Absolutely. What we can test lines up with what we can know for certain historically by this standard. Moving on to accounts of embarrassment in the Bible, the patriarchs of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were all portrayed as horrible sinners that doubted God often. For example, in the book of Genesis chapter 20, verses 1 through 16, Abraham, the father of faith and the progenitor of the Jewish nation, as well as the Messiah, was given the opportunity to demonstrate his faith in God when traveling to Egypt with his wife Sarah. In the ancient days, when you saw an attractive woman, you simply killed her husband and added her to your collection. This was known as a harem. Abraham didn't trust God to protect him, the father of faith, and Genesis admits this. He has Sarah lie and say that she is his sister. Likewise, Isaac makes the same mistake that his father made to the Canaanite king Abimelech in Genesis 26, 1 through 33, concerning his wife Rebekah. Jacob also is noted in Genesis 32, verses 22 through 32, as having to have been dragged kicking and screaming into God's will for his life. He was not a very faithful individual, yet God blesses him mightily. These are very embarrassing details to be given about the foundations of your culture and your God. The first king of Israel, going on to 1 Samuel, is portrayed as a homicidal and paranoid maniac bent on killing what would one day be Israel's greatest king, David. This is very embarrassing. The greatest king of Israel, while we're on the topic, in the book of 2 Samuel is portrayed as a horrible father whose negligence ultimately resulted in a coup d'etat. This is, of course, the Absalom incident. A adulterer and a murderer, referring to the Bathsheba incident, and as well ordered an unlawful census that cost thousands of lives. You can read these in 2 Samuel chapters 11 through 24. No details are spared about Israel's greatest king, and in fact we're almost given more attention to his faults than to his perks. And note, ancient kings generally did not look kindly upon including those details. Going on to the nation itself, Israel, from the time of the Exodus to its exile, spends all of their time walking away from and rebelling against a God who has only been good to them. You can read through the minor prophets as well as 1st and 2nd Kings to verify this. Also note that Israel and Judah, the northern and southern kingdoms, after a civil war, which is also admitted, are given more attention than the few good kings Israel had. For example, King Manasseh, King Ahab, Queen Athaliah, and Jezebel are given far more attention than Israel's good kings like Uzziah and Hezekiah. And by the way, Hezekiah is also included as giving us moments where he was very low in his faith and very low in his moral stature, as well as Uzziah being struck with leprosy when he disobeyed a very serious command of God. Also note, going on from the kings to the prophets, Israel and Judah's greatest prophets are shown at their lowest moments rather, even when they wanted to abandon God and die. For example, Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 20 and verse 9 admits in his own writing that he wanted to stop speaking in the name of God. Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 19 and verse 4 notes that he wanted to commit suicide, having his greatest demonstration of God's power through his life at Mount Carmel, ultimately resulting in failure. These details generally would have been excluded if these people were embellishing these things. And likewise, the prophet Jonah in chapter 4 and verse 9 of his account in Jonah notes that he was a whining and blubbering, there's really no way to put it nicely, a very poor moral choice on his part when he grieves over a plant, meanwhile is upset that an entire city of children and animals were spared. Going on to the New Testament, the original eyewitnesses of the resurrection were all women, whose testimony at this time in history was not allowed in Jewish court. The original leader of the early church, James, didn't believe that his biological half-brother was God and even accused him of being insane. He obviously changed his mind later, but these sort of details would have been made up by their leader unless he had to admit something. And finally, the greatest evangelist of the early church, Paul, admitted he used to murder Christians and stood by when the first Christian martyr, Stephen, was stoned to death. And as a bonus, the most well-known apostle, Peter, is called Satan by Jesus, denies ever knowing him 3 times, and does so when a little girl challenges him about it. So in conclusion, on the accounts of embarrassment, since the Old and New Testaments both include information about their key figures, note not God, but their patriarchs and prophets, that admit information embarrassing according to modern and contemporary cultural standards, while modern sensibilities, due to the influence of Christianity, deem the testimony of women as equal in court, first-century Jews did not share this sentiment. And yet, the first-century Jews that wrote the New Testament had to admit these details in every single one of the Gospels. Also note that if the nation of Israel's history is fiction, it doesn't make a lot of sense to spend more time making up embarrassing details about your fake kings unless you were admitting something. And generally, when you have to admit something, there was something to admit in the first place. The God of the New Testament the Old and New Testament rather, include too much information that goes the opposite direction of embellishment to be considered historical fiction. And finally, contemporary work. First and foremost, how early do the accounts go, as far as the evidence can support, to the original events they're reporting? Moses, first and foremost, the author of the first 5 books of the Bible, reported the Exodus and the wanderings in the wilderness, which is recorded for us in Numbers, as he directly saw it take place. The prophets that saw the rise of the kings of Israel lived during their reigns, Samuel, Nathan, and Gad accordingly. And note, we get their names not from tradition, but from the books themselves. Ezra and the Ezrahites, his followers, were reporting the return from exile and restoration of Jerusalem as they saw it take place. They're also responsible for compiling the Psalms in the order that we know it to be in today, and they also noted the ministries of Haggai, Zechariah, and possibly Malachi as they saw it take place for themselves. Note, we can't test the final one, but we can make some deductions. Going into the New Testament, Matthew and John were direct eyewitness testimonies written within the lifetimes of the other eyewitnesses, so this information could be tested. Mark and Luke interviewed eyewitnesses, and modern historians, for example, Sir William Ramsay, considered Luke a historian of the first rank even according to modern standards. The earliest creed that claims the core beliefs of Christianity, Jesus' life, death, and resurrection from the dead, included in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7, dates to within months, 2 years at most, of the first Easter, according to liberal atheist scholars. You can note these citations from the infamous Jesus Seminar, James C.Z. Dunn, John Dominic Crossan, and others. Also note that the letters of Paul date before the Gospels and were all admitted by the original eyewitnesses and affirmed, by the way, especially the Apostle Peter in 2 Peter chapter 3. And finally, the geographical details given in Acts by Luke give details about trade routes in the first century, water depths they measured off the coast when the storm Euroclydon hit, names of specific titles and leaders that were exclusive to these regions, like governor, proconsul, and others, fit into the time frame they report them to take place uniquely. They are all accurate. So in conclusion, as a whole, when compared to the Eddas, the amount of data we have from a purely historical standpoint is no comparison at all. Not a single shred of information given on the history of the Azir interacts with the world in any way that can be tested, and thus it gives us that many historical reasons to trust it. On the other hand, the Bible more than stands up to this level of criticism, and if you're looking for a religion based on history, I can't recommend Odinism. However, if you want a God worth following, I would recommend Jesus Christ. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to talking to you all very much again soon.